The word homosexuality is 157 years old. It was coined in 1868 by a Hungarian journalist named Karl Maria Kertbeny. Before that year, the word didn't exist in any language on Earth, which raises a question nobody really asks. If the word didn't exist, what did the people who came before us actually think? Because they didn't just have opinions on this. They had armies built on it. They had gods who practiced it. They had two men celebrated as the greatest heroes of democracy. And almost none of it looks like anything either side of the modern debate expects. Let's start at the beginning, not with Greece. Earlier, around 2100 BC, someone in ancient Mesopotamia was writing the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest stories in recorded history. The central relationship of that story is between Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, and a wild man named Enkidu. When Enkidu arrives in the city, the text describes how Gilgamesh loved him deeply, and how the two become inseparable companions. When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh's grief is described in terms that ancient writers reserved for the loss of a spouse. He refuses to leave the body. He weeps for 7 days. He covers his face and tears his clothes. The text says he loved Enkidu, as a man loves a woman. Scholars have debated for decades whether this relationship was romantic or not. What's not debated is this. In Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization, same-sex relationships were so common, based on evidence from artwork as well as literature, that they are depicted across multiple sources without particular comment. They weren't remarkable enough to require explanation. Move west to Egypt. It is thought that King Pepi II was gay and had a relationship with his general. The nightly exploits of Pepi II and his general is supposedly the basis for the tale of Neferkare and Sassanet, which implies that there were liaisons between men in elite circles. That's a pharaoh. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was considered a living god, and the story of his relationship with his general was famous enough to become the subject of popular literature, not as a scandal. As a story worth telling, now we get to Greece. And here the picture gets both clearer and more complicated than most people realize. In the cultures of the ancient world, there was no need for designations such as LGBTQ+, because there was no difference noted between what is now defined as homosexual and heterosexual relationships. There was no us and them dichotomy to encourage such labels. There was only us, and whoever one chose to love was one's own business. That's the key thing to understand before any of the specific stories. The ancient Greeks didn't think in the categories we think in. They didn't have a concept of sexual orientation as a fixed identity. What mattered to them was different and more complicated. But within that world, same-sex love was not hidden. It was celebrated. It was mythologized. And in one specific case, it was considered the foundation of democracy itself. Harmodius and Aristogeiton, two men in Athens, lovers. In 514 BC, they assassinated Hipparchus, the brother of the tyrant ruling Athens. Harmodius and Aristogeiton were two lovers in classical Athens who became known as the tyrannicides for their assassination of Hipparchus, the brother of the tyrant Hippias, for which they were executed. They were both killed immediately after. But what happened next is remarkable. Athens erected bronze statues of them in the public square, the first statues of real historical people ever placed in a Greek city. They were given a hero cult. Their descendants were given free meals at public expense for generations. They were held up as the founders of Athenian democracy. Two men whose love for each other was publicly known and celebrated became the symbolic origin of one of the most important political ideas in Western history. Then there's the Sacred Band of Thebes. The Sacred Band of Thebes was an elite military unit composed of 150 pairs of male lovers. Ancient sources like Plutarch described how their romantic same-sex devotion made them fearless, believing that lovers fighting side by side would rather die than abandon each other. This wasn't a fringe unit. This was considered the most elite fighting force in Greece. This infantry regiment was formed from 150 male couples, of which both partners were clearly above the age of military service. The Thebans established this corps in 378 BC in response to Spartan aggression, and with its help, they defeated the Spartans in open battle only 7 years later. They were undefeated for 33 years. The logic behind their formation, as Plutarch explains it, was simple. A man will fight harder next to someone he loves than next to a stranger. The Sacred Band eventually fell at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, defeated by Philip of Macedon and his son. His son was Alexander, the same Alexander who is widely believed to have been in love with his closest companion, Hephaestion. Alexander was overwhelmed by his grief for Hephaestion, so much that Arrian records that Alexander flung himself on the body of his friend and lay there nearly all day long in tears, and refused to be parted from him until he was dragged away by force by his companions. When Alexander reached Troy, he honored the hero Achilles at his shrine. Hephaestion honored Patroclus, Achilles' companion, whose relationship with Achilles Homer described in terms that ancient readers understood as romantic. The parallel was not accidental. It's worth pausing on what Plato, one of the greatest philosophers in history, actually thought about all of this. Because it's more complicated than either side of the modern debate usually acknowledges, in his Symposium, the speaker Aristophanes discusses same-sex relationships in a way that closely resembles a more modern understanding, with the two participants treated as equals whose relationship completes the other. In his Laws, however, Plato dismisses same-sex relationships as being unnatural and unsuited to his vision of utopian society. The same thinker, writing at different points in his life, held contradictory views, which tells you something important. The ancient world wasn't uniformly accepting of same-sex relationships. It was complicated. It was contested. During Plato's time, there were people who were of the opinion that homosexual sex was shameful in any circumstances. The ancient world contained people who celebrated same-sex love and people who condemned it. Just like every other period of human history, what it didn't have was the specific framework of identity and categorization that modern debates are built on. Now, Rome. Roman homoeroticism is closer in time to the NT world and to that of the early church, and homoerotic behavior was quite common in Rome at that time. Under certain conditions, it was accepted, but never in the way that it was celebrated in Athens or Sparta. It is claimed that, of the first 15 Roman emperors, only Claudius was entirely heterosexual in his behavior. 14 of the first 15 emperors, men who ruled the most powerful empire in the world. The Romans appear to have been the first to perform same-sex marriages. Not Greece, Rome. The empire that became the foundation of Western civilization performed same-sex marriages before the concept of homosexuality existed as a word. So what changed? The short answer is, the institutions that inherited the Roman Empire brought different attitudes with them. The word homosexual didn't appear in any Bible translation until 1946. The Greek term arsenokoites, translated as homosexual in the Bible for the first time in 1946 CE, never existed until it was coined by St. Paul in his epistles. The actual translation is male beds, and seems to refer to men who slept with men in non-Christian traditions, not to same-sex relationships. The category of sexuality as a fixed identity, the idea that you are permanently one thing or another, is modern. There are not even words in the ancient languages which translate to the modern-day homosexual and heterosexual, which were only coined in 1869 CE. The ancient world didn't think this way. It thought about acts, roles, status, and context, not about fixed categories of personhood. Here's what that means, stripped down to its simplest form. For most of recorded human history across Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, and dozens of other cultures, same-sex love was not treated as a separate category of human experience requiring its own label, its own politics, or its own debate. It was simply part of the full range of things humans did and felt. The two men who became the symbol of Athenian democracy were lovers. The most feared military unit in the ancient world was built on the logic that love makes you fight harder. A pharaoh's relationship with his general became popular literature. The word we use to describe all of this, homosexuality, didn't exist until 1868. And the framework we use to debate it, the idea of fixed orientations and identities, didn't exist until shortly after. The ancient world didn't have our debate. It just had people.